This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast shouting out the arts, sciences and mataranga Māori, brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, I'm Dr. Barb.
And I'm Trudy.
And today in the studio we have Keith McFadyen here. Chatting with us. And Keith is the Saddle Hill, am I right, Community Board member?
Yes, I am.
Saddle Hill Community Board. And also the PSA organiser based in Dunedin covering the Otago Southland. And today we thought we'd chat about unions. I don't know why I had unions on my head, but I think whenever I think of Keith, I think of unions.
Well, they're not too dissimilar in terms of a community board, in terms of representation and advocacy, so... yeah,
we might touch on a bit of both there as we go through the hour talk here. We've got a nice little chat, and I've just been doing all my homework on unions because I thought I was interested to see where they came into New Zealand and how they all started and everything. And I thought, I better not put Keith on the spot and just make him do all the...
I'm not an historian, but I've read some of the things and I think some of the stuff...
It's an amazing story. So I've just been going through Te Ara site there, and at one time New Zealand was per capita the most unionised country in the world, which is quite amazing. It really started in the 1840s. So I think that's quite topical right now because we're talking about the Treaty of Waitangi, we're talking about the principles of Waitangi, we're talking about how we honour our part as Pākehā of the Treaty of Waitangi. And of course, once that treaty was signed, then there was this big immigration to New Zealand, largely from Britain, and that was sort of a government-sponsored program where the New Zealand government they decided they needed more skilled labourers, they needed more farm labourers, they needed more skilled craftspeople, and so and what was interesting to me was that they went to the union in Britain. So they went to the National Agricultural Farm Labourers Union, the NAFLU it's called, and that's where they were recruiting people to come out, like Europeans or British people to come out to New Zealand. So that was quite interesting that it was coming from that union movement. And in response to that, like the sort of quid pro quo or the thing there was that the British Union was using that threat of we're all just going to immigrate to New Zealand to actually get better conditions and better pay in Britain. So it was quite an interesting kind of start there. They were using that as a bargaining chip to improve the working conditions in Britain. And then, of course, the people were coming to New Zealand with already that kind of mindset of this is a new society, we're going to make this country different without all the baggage that we had.
We weren't going to import the baggage of the old country, so to speak. But interesting, like that's probably the least unionised sector in New Zealand now, agriculture. And yet, if that's correct, and one of the most unionised sectors in the UK is what started it all off here, in agriculture.
It was quite. I had not realised that was a thing, but anyway, I thought that was quite an interesting.
Well, that doesn't surprise me either, because I know that in terms of colonisation, that the one of the things that happened is they brought cattle over from England, and because of dogs, a lot of the Māori had dogs, that they then created a dog tax.
Oh, yes.
So they created this dog tax because the Māori couldn't pay for, and so they would put these dogs down because they were attacking the cattle.
Yeah.
And so that's how, this dog tax come about, and, it was just, a complete colonisation of, or the way in which they did it. It was ruthless, so...
Yeah. So interesting. So instead, in some ways, they did import some of the stuff, like protectionism. Where you think, you could have. Oh, here's a really handy, resource that I could use, like these local people with local dogs and local knowledge. The opportunity to create a real partnership, a union of some sort, was missed.
Not trying at all to say that they did a great job of their aspirations, but there was definitely some idea of those aspirations. But I think they fell short. I actually thought
you were going to start off with the what's that? No, I can't think of it. The committee that was run here in Dunedin in the late 1800s about peace work. Are you coming to that?
Well, I might be coming to that, yes.
Because that's quite topical now in terms of modern slavery, this piecework stuff.
So piecework was a big thing. So I was going to go through the unions and go.
Sweating commission. Commission.
Well, it was interesting. What was really interesting to me as I was reading through and just taking some notes on the early labour and union movements was actually the pivotal role that Dunedin played all the way through, and it's Dunedin that's mentioned. So just wheeling back, they started sort of those 1840s right through to the 1880s was sort of small local trade unions. So there wasn't a lot of movement between different cities in New Zealand. So the people that were settlers here coming in were largely Scottish, largely English. They were largely just trade unions that were based in a place. So it was just like all the shoemakers in Dunedin, and it wasn't nationalised across everywhere. And before 1870, they were largely sort of single issue unions. So there'd be something that happened, there'd be a union formed, they'd fight whatever that single issue was, and then it would sort of dissolve, and that was kind of the way that unions work. Apart from this 1850s, where they were really campaigning for the 8-hour day and the 48-hour week. And Keith and I were chatting before the show, and we were saying, was it because in the Te Ara site it's very clear it's 48 hours, but if it's an 8-hour day, that's clearly just Sunday off, right? So that's not coming up to the weekend yet. That's just, but yeah, it's a big change from working an 18-hour day to going to an 8-hour day, and that's, I think, all based on the fact that people had come, like there was obviously a really close link with seamen and ships, and they have those 8-hour shifts. So you have 3 shifts of 8 hours if you're on a boat, and that sort of is where that 8. And
I think it also stems from when you talk about that England or the people like Samuel Parnell who come over and were promoting the 8-hour day. But I think over in Britain, that if you belonged to a union, you were actually banished to. You wouldn't be able to get a job anywhere. So the way in which they tackled unions over there, and I think a lot of those people come to New Zealand still knowing the value of belonging to a union and bringing those principles with them, because over in England there was a real big push to try and deal to the unions, I suppose, or anyone that belonged in the single issue unions. So Parnell come over. I think he probably come over with that view that he could start off in that way.
Yeah. And so that's, I guess, once they'd got through those sort of single issue ideas and they were going into the 8-hour day, they were campaigning for 48 hours a week, no more. And then, as Trudy was saying, it was this resistance to piecework. So that's paying people a fixed wage rather than paying them, by the... And that's still an issue with fruit pickers today, isn't it? Paying people by the basket load of fruit, and it's quite an easy way to extort people, I guess. It's kind of one of the and casual work as well. Like if you're paying people just by the hour, then it's really hard for them to make a living, I guess. So that's really, and oddly there was this, which was mentioned on the site, a maximum number of apprentices relative to the skilled tradespeople, and I think that was probably just it was that overloading of the workload on the school people. I feel like that's really relevant for lecturers and PhD students in today's discussion as well, because we've got this really deficit in New Zealand of postdocs, which is sort of that level of training between a PhD and a lecturer, and so that you get all these, the cheaper way of funding research is to fund lots of PhD students, but of course then you're relying on all the lecturers to be training them and trying to do their own research, and then there's no bridge for those people who have worked hard to learn how to do research and do their PhD. There's no bridge to get them into the next tier of being actual lecturers and being in fixed wages. So That's where, from my background, that's
Yeah.
where that rang in. But I'm not sure if I'm.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, I did my apprenticeship at the railways at Hillside Workshops, and I was one of 32 apprentices taken on each year, and that was every year.
Every year, 32 apprentices.
32 apprentices, and they were fitter electrical, welders, boiler makers.
And how many? Like, what was the sort of ratio there of skilled people training you, basically, to apprentices? Was it 1-to-1, or was it?
No. We had an apprenticeship school that you started off with, so you spent the first 3 months in Boys Town is what they called it.
Yeah.
So 32
Boys
apprentices would sit there and get kitted out, learn some skills.
Not wanting to be rude, but what sort of decade are we talking about here?
So that was 81.
Oh, you're just a young thing.
Yeah, no. I left school. Well, I talked to the careers officer, and he said, "Here's your options," and they weren't all that flash, to be fair. But that's what happens if you don't tackle the schooling issue. But
Hold on. Having an apprenticeship in a trade, it's not to be sniffed at.
back then, it was, you depending on your subject, what you achieved, your achievement, you were given certain options by the careers officers. But anyway, I have to say, I had the most fabulous time, and coming to the union as well. But 32 apprentices each year, amazing. Hillside Workshop has everything. It had every kind of tooling that you could use. I mean, the best tradesmen come out of Hillside Workshops. There's no doubt about it.
So quite pleased now that it's being reinvigorated.
Yeah. And it should have always been, because now we're short of boilermakers, we're short of fitters, we're short of electrical. We're all short of all those trades. Had they carried on doing that foresight of 32 apprentices each year, New Zealand would be in a way better position. But one of the things I will say is that the tradesmen that you talked about were the people that taught the values as well. And one of the values they had is that the railways was heavily unionised. So it was, as soon as you come in the door, you were kind of given a form or a discussion with an English man who would tell you why you are going to join the union. But it was very strong in learning all the value of why being a union at the railways was really important.
And I guess it's through New Zealand's history, it's kind of the importance of joining the union has kind of gone up and down as various different things. And I think one of the things that struck me was the various sort of economic downturns was when union membership kind of dropped, which is kind of unfortunate because it's kind of when unions, where the strength of having a union is really found, I think, because that's, when conditions can get really, really low and pay gets forced down and everything, because you're in an economic depression. That sort of happened in the 1880s, 1890s, and then again, obviously, in the big depression, in the 1930s, rather. But it's interesting because that's when there's more unemployment around, so it's actually easier to replace the workers. So it's this kind of a catch-22, I think,
I think that depends very much on why you have a union, because I argue the opposite. I think people should be in unions the whole time, not that it's not like, I need a hospital, so we should build one now. Yeah. Like, it should be something that you have the whole time.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Just looking at the trend of when union membership was strongest and when it was weakest, or when the movement was strongest.
I think that's the problem, because it's just something that people turn to when in time of need, whereas it's kind of like an investment. You need to invest in infrastructure. You need to invest
it's like insurance, isn't it? You don't just pay insurance when your house burns down, right? Yeah. You don't pay, all of those things. That's what unions basically are, in a way, is that, when insurances started, it was a group of ship owners sitting around a coffee house saying, it's all just the luck of the draw, whose ship gets blown over in the wind and whatever, so let's just pool our resources, we'll all pay a little bit, and if someone's ship goes down, then together we'll make it right? And
But
that's kind of the same thing with unions. It's that kind of solidarity of people to kind of stick together and make sure everything. And that was a big thing at the start of the unions, was actually that sickness and death benefits. So like the unions, everyone paid into it right at the start when they were negotiating those 8-hour days and the 48 hours and the piecemeal and the maximum apprentices. The last thing on that, the last thing on that list is the benefit societies for all the members, and that was about if someone got sick or someone's, if you're the only bread maker in the family and you die, then the union undertook to kind of take care of your family, which is, I guess...
But at that time, they were in competition with lodges, because lodges would do the same thing. You could pay in, and they had the same sort of insurance. They had death benefits, sick benefits. So then I think that if you think of unions as only doing that, or negotiating wages or terms and conditions, there has to be a bit more to it. And I think, and that might be where it started off, but I think all along the way, I think it's about how do you work with employers to make the workplace as a whole a better place, not just, like the PSA has got a partnership agreement, and other unions. I think we're not going to get anywhere if we stay in that them and us kind of battle all the time, and that might be where it was.
I think the PSA made a conscious decision around that, back then. After the Employment Contracts Act come in the 90s, they had to regroup.
That's the 1990s.
1990s,
not the 1890s.
So we had to regroup and look at what it is that we're doing, and we thought about it. Do we want to be an organisation that just sits there and bargains once a year, comes and bargains once a year? And so, our strategy was to change that. Strategy was to say, hey, actually, we want to work alongside you. I mean, it took a wee bit to get members thinking around that way as well, which is to say, look, hey, there's got to be a compromise here. We've got to work together. I mean, the people that are doing the job, we believe, are the best people to talk to about how you might structure the job or how it might look or how you can improve it and what productivity gains you can make. They're the best people. Not someone dictating.
Which is quite an interest, like when you look at it, it's obvious, like to anyone who's ever worked, not just in the top layer, it's really obvious that the people doing it know where productivity gains are best. From it.
The other thing is that we're adults. Like, imagine going into a workplace where, somebody, I don't know, I don't want to categorise people as either being elderly or stuck in their ways or traditionalists, but imagine going into a workplace where they kind of treat you like a child. I mean, it's like...
Well, that is based on that whole aristocratic, the people owning the factories were of a different social class as well.
Yeah.
And it was thought that the labourers were just like children, that they had to be, made to do the things, and it was that's kind of the...
It's a hangover from feudalism.
I mean, even those coal miners we were talking about earlier, like coal miners, they went down to the coal shafts, and they weren't allowed to come back up to have their sandwiches or their morning tea. So they'd have black hands, and their sandwiches would be, disgusting. So they asked to come back up for 15 minutes so they could wash their hands and then eat their food and then go back down again. And then, they would refuse that. Yeah. So it was like, and it still happens today. There are still employers that will, freely give their gratitude to the people that are working for them in a way that, they're not just going to come out there and say, hey, I think you're doing a really great job and here's a pay rise. It's very seldom do we hear that. And so, unless... and then we get blamed for that, obviously, because the reason why you haven't got a pay rise is your union hasn't negotiated with us, or they haven't, whatever it might be. It's, it's a fallacy. But coming back to Trudy's point, we work with employers now rather than work against them. And those that want to do that and those that are proactive around that, we get on really well, and we work through the issues as it is. That's not to say we don't have our positional differences.
Yeah. But I guess, the bottom line really is no one really wants a strike, right? No one wants to have
So last resort.
Because the workers don't get paid when there's a strike, particularly, you're not PSA is not with hospitals and things, but particularly with the young. Are you?
Yeah. So
sorry.
I mean,
like
the
young doctors strike. Like the last thing that doctors and nurses and people who've dedicated their life to looking after people want is, or anyone in the health sector really, and the same with education. The last thing that they want is to go on strike.
But part of that is why that's a lot of the reasons that's happening too, is why they're protracted it, is because they're actually so genuine in that they will cover off emergency care, that they won't all go out and strike. They'll actually a proportion of them, and that puts them at a disadvantage, because then they're taking advantage of the fact that the health management then go, well, we'll be able to manage, and on the goodwill of those people that actually provide those services. Will always provide that emergency services because they're conscientious and care about people, right? Yeah. So that it works against them in terms of their ability.
It's a strange situation, that really, and I guess it's also different in contrast to that historical context, because those big organisations, they're actually the other partner in the negotiation is the government. Right, so when you're doing those negotiations, like it's not the Union Steamship Company or the Westport Coal Company of the 1890s. It's the government that you're negotiating with there, and so you can't, like, I don't know. For me, I would sort of think the government has more of an obligation than perhaps a private steam company to look after its workers, because they're part of its.
Yeah,
I think it goes back to that. They're part of the people of the country, right? You want good working standards for your people as part of being a government, and when you happen to be the employer as well, you should be sort of leading the way as a public institution, I would have thought.
It's slightly different. The government funds these departments to do that, so where they may intervene is in labour laws like minimum wage, minimum working hours, living rates, all but that kind of legislation.
It's still the health minister for health that negotiates with the unions, isn't it?
No, you don't negotiate with the minister. You negotiate with I don't know who he is or she is.
Well, normally HR it depends on whether it's it's a CEO, a Crown-owned enterprise, in which case it'll be with the board will make the final decision. And you're right, in terms of funding from government, we see that in community public services with all the home care support workers and that are funded through the government, through the DHBs or Te Whāti Ora. They're then funded to the community organisations that provide care for our elderly and disabilities.
So who does the union negotiate with then?
And this is what I'm saying about working alongside.
To me, that seems like the hardest question to start with. If I was just a worker in there, I wouldn't know.
Yeah, no. So
you just get given a salary or a wage or whatever, and whatever. I don't even know how that would work.
Well, I mean, we've got the pay equity claims that we got on the table, which is about supporting the wages for female workers. And comparing them with other male-dominated roles, and so there's that part of it. But community public services, we'll have to work with the organisation. The organisation might say, "Hey, look, we're paying as much as we're getting funded for. That we can't pay any more, right?" And so we'll go on both fronts with the employer and the union. We'll go to the particular DHB and then government to say these organisations need to be funded. I suppose that come up in the budget around disabilities and more funding going into disability. So we're always advocating for that as well, for more funding from because effectively what you got is the government departments devolving their responsibilities to community people in the community, mental health issues and all that kind of stuff, and then the government is just funding it through these community organisations at a lower pay. I mean, we had people driving their own vehicles between, driving their own vehicles to go and care for people, elderly people who are still living at home, and going in there and driving their car and having to pay their own petrol.
Yeah, so they got the depreciation on the cars.
The car, they had to pay their own petrol, and they're still getting just the minimum wage, whatever that might have been. So that was, it was cruel in lots of ways, And you have the impact of that is that people do it because they really care for those in the community, the elderly, and they do it for the love of it, but they're also getting penalised in terms of payment. So the PSA was able to fix that travel case up.
Right.
So they now get paid for their travel between their clients. They get paid the IRD rate in terms of their vehicle or some amount in terms of their vehicle usage. And we've been able to get them up in terms of pay equity. We've been able to get their pay rates up to a decent amount, but still have to be ongoing assessments around ensuring that maintains.
And I guess having that partnership allows you to have sort of inflation adjusted increases in pay rather than because otherwise you just as inflation goes up, you're just losing buying power with your wages.
Yeah.
And unless you've got some sort of increment in there, but that's something that at some point had to be negotiated as a starting point, right?
There's a whole lot of mechanisms in terms of pay. Pay's not that necessarily that easy. There's a lot of market rate data that's always supplied in terms of the employer. We're always putting on the table the CPI and any of the cost of living. You'll see the rates are going up, for example, in Dunedin, quite a significant amount. That's going to impact on people.
Yeah.
Some pay rise they got last year is not going to help that. So, but neither are we going to get a 17.5% pay increase from the rates rise.
And then you can argue from economists about wage inflation. So, oh my God, there must be a better way.
Well, that's partly why the union's been pushing for the living wage as well, because the living wage tries to or attempts to work out the calculation of what you'd need to actually pay all the minimum kind of bills that one requires. And we've got a lot of employers, a great number of employers who actually pay the living wage as opposed to the minimum wage. It's about a $2 difference.
But it's an interesting concept, the living wage, right? Because it just, I don't know who actually works out what the living wage is.
I think that there's a living wage group.
It says it's an independent body that works it out, right?
Yeah.
And it just gets adjusted every year. So if you just say, okay, you're getting the living wage, you don't have to work out what the increment is or whatever it is. You can just say that's in your contract. That's what you're getting. You're getting the living wage.
I think it's, and I think this is the other thing where unions help is that we say that they're saying we recognise that these roles are important to a community, so they should be paid the living wage. It's about how you think people in your community should be recognised, how they should be paid, how they should be treated, and I think it's really, really important.
I think it's an important point actually, is that at the end of the day, unions are about fairness, right? And that's why we talk about equal pay. So that I had a note here in 1905, equal pay for teachers. That's when it came in, and I think there's this ongoing discussions probably about that, and in every sector of work, there's probably still ongoing discussions about that. I know definitely in academia, it's not a solved problem, but it's interesting that it was that's 120 almost years ago.
It really is quite offensive and disgusting. But we've been trying to tackle it with lots of different governments around getting women paid the same as men.
Yeah.
But it's just so hard to achieve at the moment. But I mean, some organisations have achieved it, and then others are just lagging.
Yeah.
And I can't believe that we're not. We're talking about 2024. We'll still be talking about it in 2030 if we're not careful. But
and it's interesting. I was reading an article the other day about a couple of organisations in the UK are starting to look at their wage rates based on need. So the needs of the employers and employees, I should say. That's quite interesting.
Eh?
Yeah. So if you're I suppose with a young family, you've got a lot more costs than other people, but then who determines what your needs are?
But
I thought it was an interesting concept.
I think the universal pay is quite an interesting concept. That's the Star Trek mode where
You don't get paid, and you just rock up and say, ask the machine, and it'll give you whatever you want.
I'm just, with currently going through the public service cuts that we're seeing, I mean, I really wished we'd had that social insurance,
Yes.
The social insurance would have been so much more
Just
helpful.
explain a bit more what social insurance is.
We were pushing for, you'll see it through the Council of Trade Union, CTU, we were pushing for it's like a ACC levy. So it was a levy on employees and employers. Should their job, they lose your job, then they would get a kind of equivalent of the 80% pay of their salary for 80% for 1 year.
Right.
And if they lost their job, and that would mean that they could continue to pay their bills, they could retrain and look at other roles and jobs and all that kind of stuff. So they wouldn't be... wouldn't face financial hardship. Because if you think about some of the things that are happening in the public service at the moment around people losing their jobs, actually there might be 2 years in a family and both years lose your job in a particular ministry. There's 2 years they're out, haven't got a job. And you might have gone from 160,000 for 2 years down to whatever the unemployment benefit might be, and it might be 48. So you've all your bills and things that you've got, all your. But however, the social insurance, which was going to be something like, I can't remember exactly, so don't quote me, but something like
it's
$1.
It's live radio. You're just automatically quoted.
Yeah, but it was a contribution from the employee and a contribution from the employer. It might have been exactly like the ACC levies. It might have been 60 cents per employee per $100, and the same for an employer. But had you lost your job, you would have got 80% of your salary for whatever it might have been for the next 12 months. Should you have lost your job.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really key way that you can intervene when, in these changing economic times. It's about, if you want to get all economic, it's about market failure. The market's failed, so you need to change your occupation. But this gives you an opportunity to retrain.
It's really hard to retrain and move in a year anyway. But
if you've got no money, and if the unemployment benefit doesn't cut it for anything, and then you might get a stand down because you've got redundancy payments. So you're stuck where you are, and it's just, I think it's appalling.
Yeah, it's quite a strange, but.
Well, it might also stop that migration of people, because we know what we know is people in the science sector and public services are going to lose their jobs very soon. They don't necessarily have something that there's there, or that they're just thinking about the now. So they, potentially they'll sell the house and then say, "I'll go to Australia." Might as well to go to Australia and try my luck over there to get a job in the sciences. Sciences.
Yep.
You might as well go over there, and so you kind of lose them quite quickly. Had they had 12 months social insurance, they might have found something else. There might have been a vacancy, or somebody retired in one of the organisations that they did previous work for. They could apply for those roles and they could have gone into it. You wouldn't necessarily lose them. They wouldn't feel that sense of...
I have to do something now because I'm going to be stuck. Yeah.
So, but we didn't get it, and we're seeing 5,000 or 6,000 public servants coming out on onto
crazy numbers, eh?
Yeah. Interesting enough, I know.
So, that's all under you, isn't it? So the PSA is a public service
union,
union, and that is the biggest. I think it's the biggest union by far in New Zealand. Or you saying before the show, 90,000 members, over 90,000. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
however, I would like to remind the PSA.
Oh, right.
That when the parliamentary service opened the offices and electorates, they wouldn't let their members join because they weren't core public servants. So,
really?
Yeah, so that's a bit of a brickbat, but also a shout out because we've moved along since then, and now they'll take anybody and everybody.
That's what happens when you're born in the 60s. You remember these things, right?
Actually, it's my colleague who's 20 years old. She's the one that reminds me all the time.
I forgive.
Yeah. But it's just how things change.
The PSA, what else do they cover? They cover
PSA. They cover the DHBs. We've got public health nurses. We have physiotherapists. We have all the specialist roles in the DHBs.
All the CRIs.
CRIs. We have community public services.
Universities.
Just looking at my phone.
The tertiary education, don't they have a separate
So
union?
tertiary education union, we work alongside those with them in terms of they
because it's a bit odd, isn't it, with education? Because the primary, secondary, and tertiary education all have separate unions.
Some of it's
and
a little bit,
possibly also early childcare.
Yeah, some of it stems back, from years ago. So PSA used to cover technicians at the university, and then it morphed into there's no technicians now. That morphed into something else, and so there's a little bit of that. We have the unions are working together.
Yeah,
and many organisations.
And of course, that's going back to the roots of unions and the strength of it. That's when the real strength came, was when unions actually started working together, not just the same workforce all across the nation, but actually the seamen and the miners, and weirdly the shearers union. So it was the shearers, the seamen, and the miners. And I was thinking, how do the seamen and miners? But of course, everything was coal fired then. So the railways and the boats, the ships, were all run on coal, and so that's where that real strong link there came between the railways and the unions and those port strikes, because there wasn't containers, so everything had to be offloaded by lots of people doing quite hard labour and quite dangerous labour, I imagine, at the ports, and you could shut that down for a day and everything would be backed up. So it must have had quite an immediate effect. And again, that's really relevant to Dunedin, because Port Chalmers, Dunedin was the biggest city in New Zealand in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That gold rush, everything was based around Otago, Dunedin, and Port Chalmers was a massive port. And that,
hold on.
Well, I think
Dunedin, there's a port just out down the hill here, not just Port Chalmers.
I think they come.
Board representation.
But I think they come right up to the doorstep, didn't they?
They did, but Port Chalmers was always a bigger port than the Dunedin port, because it's got the deeper channel. It was always a bigger port. And I've got it written right here, the 1819 maritime strike,
listeners,
actually started with the seamen and the watersiders at Port Chalmers, Dunedin, as they walked off the job in September 1890. And that was an industrial dispute that started in Sydney because of the close relationship between Australia and New Zealand. And unfortunately, that was actually quite detrimental to the whole union movement at the time, because they just busted the strike. So that big Westport Coal Company and the Union Steamship Company, so that all the ports across, after Port Chalmers went out, all the ports across New Zealand went out, all the miners went out in solidarity with the Australian ports. And unfortunately, at that time, it was that little bit of a depression, the late 1880s, 1890s, and there was just an oversupply of workers, so they could actually just get other people to come in, and the
strike busters.
The strike busters, yeah, and they actually say they crushed the unions, and then that really led to reforming, like a second wave of reforming the unions after that, and thinking how they were going to do it. But yeah, and it was really pivotal, because it must have been exciting times, because it was right in the middle of an election as well, and that's when the Liberal Labour government came in, because the Liberal government couldn't form a government without some Labour politicians, which were obviously part of this union movement.
And I think that government institutes some of the early Labour legislation, so it's kind of like we have this weird cycle where immediate action gets crushed, but that gets followed by some sort of incremental legislative improvements.
That's exactly what I was thinking when I was reading through those dates. I was thinking, okay, because there was all like this, this massive maritime strike, and then the end result was they got crushed, and they basically they had to go back to work, and they got almost nothing, or less than what they had before they started that strike. But then, of course, immediately following that, so 6, 8, 12 months, they had those incremental changes in legislation which had far-reaching and kind of carried on going, which is amazing. And of course, Dunedin was also famous for it. So this is going right through into 1921. Only 2% of the female workers were in unions. So it was really dominated by white men, except for that shearers union, which was dominated by Maori. and the Dunedin Tailoresses Union, and that was huge because it was dominated by women and it was the first female union, which is Dunedin, go Dunedin. And that's where, the Roslyn Mills, and we had so many mills back then. If you go to Toitu, there's just mills everywhere. And that, it was a horrible industry, I think, at the time when there was hand weaving and big looms and machinery, and it was really quite dangerous when they first started automating all of that. And that was that piecemeal that Trudy was talking about before, that was huge. And
the sweating commission,
yeah. So that was.
If you're really interested in this, Professor Eric Olsen from the History Department of the University run a huge project called the Caversham Project, where they looked at Caversham from about 902 to 22 and looked at all aspects of living and working in the suburb of Caversham. And it's quite fascinating because it covers the railway workshops, Parnell, the daylight saving, but then also you've got some of those old mention-y things on the embankment, because that was where some of the first rich people, I suppose, for want of a better word, lived in Dunedin. So he's did this huge study looking at a period of time, and it was really fascinating about...
maybe we should get him on. That sounds really interesting. I don't know.
I was just going to say, God, I hope he's still alive. I hope he's not listening, because it would be really embarrassing.
Oh, dear. We shouldn't be laughing. Gosh, what's the matter with me, honestly? But, yeah, no...
Apologies.
Well, in terms of history, you're right. And a lot of things we had to move on, I suppose. I think there was some pretty aggressive behaviours back then about trying to break unions, as there was with unions who, at a drop of a...
Oh, yes.
At a drop of a...
What was the old rule? You get your fag tissue out and you put it out, and if you got one drop of rain on your fag tissue,
we're out.
Water.
So I think there was a combination of things on both parts, but the seriousness of that coal mine in terms of people not able to eat, clean their hands to eat food and things like that. And those were the probably precursor for the reason why unions existed and belong, right? And because there's a degree of fairness around that. And I suppose, again, we talked earlier, the first two world wars, we celebrate Anzac Day in terms of, people died, fought and died for our country. There was a lot of people, and I'm not belittling that, but in terms of Labour Day, there's a lot of people, unionists, who fought really hard to get the terms and conditions people enjoy today, and yet we kind of don't celebrate it the same, or people aren't aware of.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't just even realise that the hours that we work, or the fact that we have weekends, the fact that we have any sick leave at all, the fact that we have public holidays of any sort. It's all of that comes, the fact that we have any sort of health and safety.
Well, that's right.
Not just tea breaks and the ability to go to the toilet when you want without asking someone.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you work in a DHB, for example, it's very sometimes you can't get a break because of the the amount of blood. Patients you've got to deal with, and you don't even get your break, But it's there. It's in law. It's there. It's a term and condition of employment, and there are a lot of those, like you said, sick leave and bereavement leave, and all those were fought for that extreme purpose, right?
And I guess it's going back to that fairness in society and valuing people as people. Like, people have the right to have a life and live that life, and people dying, needing to go to funerals, that's all part of everyone's life, and it shouldn't really be that you can't go because it has to be something about society. That do we want a society where people are unable to just live their lives in a manner that has dignity and is fair across people? And you could argue that we're nowhere near that point where we are having some equality of dignity across lives, but I think we're still aiming for it.
Yeah.
It's about the aspiration, I think, and it's about keeping fighting until we do get there, and until we do get equal pay and equal rights, and just those kind of...
It goes to everyone gets a vote, right? And collectively you vote for whatever you vote for, and the same. So it's the collective nature of people organising together get better outcomes.
Yeah.
That's just what happens. I mean, that's what happens. If you belong to a union and you organise yourself, you get better outcomes. That's it's in research and in data. So that's what we do. We organise people to. But what I'm saying, we've moved. Advocacy. We've moved on, and we're working alongside employers to understand what their needs are, so, as long as they understand what our needs are. But you're right. There's a whole lot of factors that come into to what can be achieved at any one time, and I'm pretty proud of what we do here. In the PSA nationally and also locally, we work. So
the PSA is the biggest union in New Zealand at the moment. Is it still big in Dunedin unions? Is Dunedin still known as a?
Well, Otago Southland for PSA. I mean, is probably. It's funny you should say, in terms of history, that Dunedin seems to be a birthplace of that. And in Otago Southland for PSA, our density is probably the highest throughout New Zealand, right? So we I don't know. It could be anywhere between 80 and 100% in certain organisations, as opposed to maybe the national average of 60%. So Dunedin seems to be, and Otago Southland seem to be leading the way in terms of PSA membership, which is great.
Because that's quite strong numbers, isn't it? I mean, I was looking up some numbers here, and. September 1890, that's back when they had that massive maritime strike, they had in this one maritime council, which was drawing together all the maritime unions and all the coal miners, they had 20 to 60,000 members, and at that time the New Zealand population was 670,000. So it was a real whack of the population was in a union, and that's not counting all the family of the person that was in the union, because it's still back in the day.
I think it was right. Trudy will correct me if I'm wrong. I think union membership was compulsory right up to about 88, 87, 86.
Which was one of those things those Labour governments came in and they just said, okay, well,
and it went from 80-90% union membership down to hopefully I think we're back up to about 20% now. And so, it really did strip union membership. And overnight, terms and conditions of employment. So if there's any reason at all you need to be a part of a union, it's because what we know of is that wages and terms and conditions went backwards when we de-unionised.
And I think part of that is that it must be useful for employers to be able to negotiate terms and conditions with one body. Like there's the Individual Contracts Act, yes, you can now go and negotiate your contract individually with your employer. I could just see my HR manager at the time rolling their eyes saying, oh my God, I'm going to have 300 people lined up at the door to negotiate my contract.
Actually,
so
I remember
the whole thing about that Individual Contracts Act, and it only applied and the unionism and all that only applied to organisations that had 20 or more staff. So a whole lot of small businesses whose staff weren't necessarily unionised anymore weren't covered by it. And the ones who really benefited from it, and their employers actually who benefited, because you want to be able, to spend your time.
I remember when that came in, oh my goodness, at the time I was working in cafes trying to fund my way through first year university, and I was on absolute minimum wage, like $6.80 an hour, and no breaks of any sort. I had smoko breaks that you were allowed to take if you smoked, and I still annoys me because I didn't smoke, so I couldn't have a smoke break. So
you didn't lie. You didn't
it was just ridiculous. But I remember having these. I mean, we had quite a nice workplace, and I got on really well with the people, the owners. But the owner was an ex-radio NZ person, and he loved the fact that he could do an individual contract because he could put his own things in, and I was just like absolutely appalled. I was like, okay, but that's because you've got the power to do that. The whole point is that the people who've got no power.
Yeah, and you're right, Barb. You're right. In terms of that's our kids and our grandkids are going into these workplaces, and that they may or may not have the skills to be able to do that. To have someone like myself or somebody who can come along and support and assist that person and not be treated unfairly or treated in a disrespectful way, because again I can make the point we're adults, so people That's what we're real faces. We're not. The word union is a kind of an ugly word in some people's view, or it's a smelly word in some way. It's actually just, it's me here as an individual supporting a workplace to achieve the things they need to achieve, working along the employer and making sure that people are treated fairly and with dignity and respectfully. Equally, we do the same thing.
It's also about balancing things out as well, because if there's a dispute between an employer and an individual employee, the employer's obviously got all the funds and all the expertise of the lawyers and everything of the company behind them, and that's a huge amount of resource. Whereas you've got this employee who's actually got, how do they even start to argue their case? How do they even, get to grips
there's an
with what
imbalance
things
of power,
is?
right?
And that imbalance of power, if you're just based, that is quite a big thing.
Yeah, and that's what the Employment Relations Act was designed to try and address, that imbalance of power. But can I just make one last point, just in regards to health and safety? I mean, we also pride ourselves in making sure that health and safety. Now, again, health and safety is starting to have a connotation, a dirty connotation. These buggers are trying to create paperwork for us to fill out.
And the nanny state and all that.
The nanny state. Actually, if you go along to Workers' Memorial Day, in May, and you see all the crosses of all the people that have gone to work at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock that morning and not come home at night, you kind of get a sense that actually, did the employer take all practical steps to ensure that person's safety? They might think they did, but actually the person still didn't come home. And it's not just one or two white crosses. There are hundreds of them. And this is just in Dunedin. Imagine across the rest of New Zealand. So that's one thing, we'll never back down from, is that health and safety is really important. And actually, if you're doing all the right things, you're right, you've got everything sorted out, and you're doing the right briefings and all that kind of stuff, then it should be a breeze.
Yeah. I'm finding, because working in that area as a site manager, that from when it first came in 2015, that it's kind of more just automatic now. People rock up with the right stuff. It isn't the challenge that it first was, and I think that's really valuable, the work that the unions and that have gone on to make sure that happens, and because it's really so it might be that the directors are going to get fined or whatever, but it's not. It's more than
they should be, though.
It's more, but it's more than that. It's a fundamental thing about, you want all your workers to go home. You don't want to have to ring someone who's been a contractor in your site to say their family member that, look, I'm sorry, we didn't take all practical steps.
But I think it had to have that thing of personal responsibility for the directors to make it a thing that actually was taken seriously at all levels, all the way up. I think that.
Well, I don't think they should. And director, so I'm going to do that in the first place. And then
just to balance that, But just to balance that, anybody that, even a worker, a union member that is doing something that is, clearly they've been, instructed not to do. We would support the employer to ensure that there is an education process goes around that, and that worker knows clearly that their responsibilities to keep themselves safe is also equally important. An obligation on them just as well as the employer. But
because it's about the whole workplace, right?
Exactly.
It's not about individuals at the end of the day. It's about, keeping everyone safe and
that will always be an agenda item on our discussions with management, along with how things are going, health and safety, making sure all those things are important, are discussed. And we don't just do that on a bargaining process. We do that now. We work with the employer 12 months of the year, not just every now and again. So that's PSA's position, is that we want to work alongside employers and our members to ensure that the workplace is as safe as and as fair as it can be.
Yeah. So I guess we're just wrapping up now. What do we see the future of unions? Is it going up? What do we see the future of unions being?
I think until we can get successive governments or governments to actually back, core terms and conditions, stuff in legislation, social insurance, and ability for people to be able to address issues as they come up for themselves, like you say, there will always be a place for a union, and I can't see any reason why people would be, shy of that, because, like I said, it's changed. It's not like it used to be. We're now in a proactive group of organisations that want to work alongside for the betterment of our members.
Yeah, and one one quick response. It just occurred to me that we were talking about the unions and then how that kind of right from the start, that kind of interacted with politicians. And of course, that's quite clearly linked to the Labour Party. But where's that link now? Because they are separate entities, aren't they? The union.
Yeah, so the PSA is not affiliated to any particular political party. However, we will, and we always do, is we always put out asking or seeking from each of the political parties what their position is on employment and how it will affect our members. So, we're looking for parties that will, promote the things that we're promoting, which is around, fairness at work, health and safety, and
And if you're really interested in unionism and coal miners on the West Coast, there's a really good book called Coal, Class and Community that you might want to read.
Interesting. Cool. No, that's great. Hey, thank you very much for joining us today, Keith. It's been a fabulous chat, and I've learned a whole heap of things, and also obviously from my esteemed colleague here, Trudy, who always teaches me things every day, day in and day out. It's her cross to bear.
Thanks, team.
No, it's great. Thanks.
You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on ORFM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by ORFM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.